This is a solid 30-minute 1 hour, trust me, I really tried to make it 30 minutes of literally everything you need to know about EU4 trade. To go from the most basic stuff, like how to get your merchants, to the most detailed thing possible for this game. Yes, even trade steering, and you can proudly proclaim that you have a master's degree in EU4 if you watch this video until the end. Surprisingly, even with 3000 hours in the game, there were lots of stuff that I had no clue about before actually making this video. So stay tuned and rate yourself on the scale of EU4 knowledge. So let's kick it off with trade nodes, the heart of the entire trade system in EU4. Every bit of trade happens within these nodes, and every single province belongs to one of them. There's a total of 80 nodes, and each one has a local value, which is just the combined trade value of all the provinces in that node. Now there are some special nodes that you should know about, end nodes like the English Channel, Genoa and Venice. These are the ultimate destinations for trade, where all the value will eventually end up or get collected on the way there. On the flip side, we have starting nodes like Patagonia or Hudson's Bay. These are the exact opposite of black holes. Any value they create gets sucked away almost immediately, so they are really bad. Like really. So in EU4, trade only flows in one direction no matter what you do, and it always moves towards Europe. We are playing Europa Universalis after all. Generally, a node is decent if you have more flows coming in versus coming out. So let's take Alexandria. It produces a lot of value, but the Mamluks lose most of it to powerhouses like Constantinople and Genoa. On the other hand, nodes like Sevilla or Constantinople are fantastic, because they have multiple inputs and only one output, which Spain or Ottomans usually control anyway. So even though it's not technically an end node, in most situations it kinda is, and I'll explain why in a bit. Here's a tier list of all 80 trade nodes in the game by Lemoncake, and I generally agree with him, but I would create a few tiers lower than D to separate the bad ones from the absolute garbage. Okay, so trade nodes can either be domestic or foreign, depending on how much control you have over them. It's considered domestic if you control 50% or more of the provincial trade power within that node, and foreign if you don't. Domestic nodes are stable even when you're expanding like a maniac and dealing with overextension, because foreign nodes get the 1% penalty to trade power for every 1% of overextension. That should also explain the different trade power bonuses you can get in the game. Global trade power, which applies everywhere and is pretty good. Domestic trade power, which basically helps you control what you already own. And trade power abroad, which helps you steal more stuff from your neighbors. Alright, so we've got trade flowing, but how do we grab as much of it as possible? Let me break it down. First of all, centers of trade and estuaries are your best friends. So provinces like London, with a center of trade and an estuary, are like trade gold mines. For example, a province with a center of trade can have a base power of around 10 compared to just 1 or 2 for a regular province. The more trade power you have, the more trade you control. Pretty simple, right? If the province has 10 development, you can upgrade its center of trade to level 2, and at 25 you can upgrade it to level 3. The higher the level, the more trade power it gives. So 5 at level 1, 10 at level 2, and 25 at level 3. And the river estuaries give 10, except for a few exceptions. You can boost this even further by building a trade building in these key provinces. Oh, you should also pay attention to your autonomy, as 10% of province autonomy reduces its trade power by 5, so keep that in mind. This doesn't apply to trade companies, but we'll get to that a bit later. Next up, I wanna talk about caravan power. This comes into play in inland trade nodes, so those without a coastline, like Champagne or those 3 German brothers. Placing merchants in these nodes gives you a caravan bonus of up to plus 50 flat trade power, and is calculated by dividing your development by 3. So if you have 150 dev or more, then you get the max possible bonus. It's not game changing, but it's pretty nice considering that it's a flat bonus and will further scale with your trade power modifiers. This is also why trade centers are extremely important, as any flat bonus will further increase with trade buildings or other modifiers. Oh, this is also why any inland trade node is a terrible place to be, as any decently sized nation with a merchant there will get some influence and steal the trade from you. You can see this yourself while playing as France, for example, because even if you control every single province in the Champagne node, you'll not get even remotely close to 100% because of random German miners. On the other hand, if you're England, then you most definitely should put your merchant there instead of Lubeck, for example, as you'll gain the caravan bonus and steal more trade from France of all people.
France was France.
So that's an extra bonus. Next, you can use your light ships to protect trade as well. They can give you anywhere between 2 to 5 trade power per ship, depending on your depot tech. Not huge, but every bit helps, especially if a lot of your money is leaking away to Spain or something. If you have the right DLC, you can even build a flagship with trade route maps for an extra +1 trade power per ship, and in this case, even transport ships will give you just a bit of trade power. You should also note that this can be further boosted with the right admiral, as you get an additional 5% per admiral maneuver pip. And if you can't protect trade in a node, it might be because of trade range or supply range. In that case, you'll need a coastal province in the node to get there, as otherwise your ships will just die to attrition, and they're not that dumb to sail around the world just to do some trade, right? Now, this is something that not many people know, but even if you don't have a single province in the trade node, you can still gain trade power there through transfers from traders downstream. Let's say you're playing as Britain and you control the Cape of Good Hope, and there are Zanzibar, Coromandel and Malacca that are flowing to you. The more provincial, again very important, provincial trade power you have, the more trade power you get in the other nodes, 20% to be exact. So there's a point in increasing your trade power by upgrading trade centers, even if you control 100% of the trade node, simply because it will allow you to steal the trade from other nodes you might not control. Also, mercantilism can help you with that, because it gives a provincial trade power modifier up to 200% at 100 mercantilism, but it's rarely worth investing 100 diplo points in that, and you are usually better off developing your lands instead. Transfers from traders downstream are the main reason why expanding further upstream, so like conquering Ragusa as the Ottomans for example, good for your trade. It eliminates any potential thieves getting your valuable trade. Okay, so one of the trickiest parts of managing trade in EU4 is figuring out how to effectively use your merchants, especially when it comes to transferring trade. So first things first, how do you even get merchants? You can get merchants from ideas and policies as a global trade institution, and the decision to found an Indian trade company that requires you to have a capital outside of Asia and have an East Asian or Indian province. You can also get merchants from colonial subjects with at least 10 provinces, and most importantly, trade companies that control over 51% of the provincial, again very important, provincial trade power within a trade node. You also need the set 51% of trade power to actually be in the trade company itself, and simply owning 51% of the node is not enough. Merchants steer the trade wherever you want, and they give you additional value depending on your trade steering, which I'll talk about in a second. They also give you a flat 2 trade power, which I'll just ignore because it's just too sad and who cares about that honestly. Now let's talk about actually transferring trade. This is where the competition heats up. In any trade node, you've got countries trying to transfer trade and those trying to collect it. Those transferring trade are essentially fighting against those trying to keep it. Even if you're not actively transferring trade, that doesn't mean your trade won't be moved by others. Take PES for example. I control 32% of the trade power there. I don't have a merchant right now, so whoever has a merchant there can move the trade in their direction using my trade power, even if they only have 1% or so. If no one has a merchant in a node that pushes trade into a few other ones, so like Pest, then the value will split evenly. If I place a merchant and set them to transfer trade, I can steer it in whichever direction I prefer. On the flip side, if I actually decide to collect here, I'll use my trade power to stop the value and actually earn money here, but I'll get a super big hit to my trade power as it's not my main node. The penalty is usually more than 50%, which is the base value, but sometimes it's worth it, especially when it's a rich trade node that realistically can't reach your home node. One last thing to note, each merchant transferring trade gives you a bonus of 10% trade power in your capital node. It can be a pretty significant bonus and you'll lose it if you start collecting trade elsewhere, so keep that in mind. Alright, so let's talk about trade steering, which is one of those game mechanics that's super powerful but often misunderstood. It's all about increasing the value of trade as it moves from one node to another and can seriously boost your income if you play your cards right. In the case of this run, where I have the Netherlands transferring trade from Aleppo to Constantinople. As you can see, I have about 48 ducats being transferred to Constantinople, but actually, if you put your mouse over there, you can see that the actual value leaving the node is 42.62 ducat and it's being increased up to 47.69 thanks to the modifiers from my merchants and the trade steering. The Netherlands increases outgoing value by just under 7%, 3.5% from Ragusa and just under 2% from Montenegro. So how does it work? Let me explain. It's not just a random number, so here's the math. The first merchant you place in a node adds a 5% bonus to outgoing trade value. On top of that, you add your trade steering modifier, which in my case is about 35%. So what it means is that my outgoing trade value increases by 5% multiplied by 1.34. So in this case, it's just under 7%. In certain nodes, so like here I have a trade company, you can use a local venture trade company investment to increase your trade steering even more. So let's see, in this case, if I do just that, my outgoing value will not be increased by just 6.7%, but it will be increased by 9.2. So in this case, it's as if my trade steering value is 84% just for this specific node.
Hey, that's pretty good.
Basically, altogether, the total outgoing trade value increases through trade steering and the default 5% modifier from the merchant, and stacking these modifiers together is why having merchants in key nodes along your trade route can make a massive difference in your trade income. So for example here, when a merchant actually arrives to Basra, you can see that this value is also being increased by the same 6.7%, then it's increasing again in Aleppo by 6.7%, plus the 50% from the trade company investment for a total of 9%. And if I had a world conquest Netherlands and pushed everything to the English channel, I could have built a much longer chain, and all these modifiers stacking together will create an enormous amount of value. So it's just like investing, you know. They say if you invest into S&P 500 or whatever, 10% yearly return and blah blah blah, and here we are becoming a quadrillionaire. Basically, it's the same logic with trade steering. It's just that not many people know that the 5% base value comes from any merchant, not just yours. It could be someone else's. In the case of Aleppo specifically, we have 3 merchants steering trade towards Constantinople, and all of the modifiers multiply in a certain way. Just a bit about how do we actually get trade steering. The most reliable way for everyone to get it is through the naval tradition. So in this case, my naval tradition is just about 10, so not really a lot, and I'm getting around 10% increase through my trade steering. And you can get naval tradition from protecting trade and especially exploring the world during the age of discovery or something. The more of your naval force limit you use to actually protect trade, the more naval tradition you'll get. Keep in mind that if multiple countries are steering trade from the same node, so like here in the case of Aleppo, it's not just me, it's also Ragusa and Montenegro steering the trade towards Constantinople, that can multiply the outgoing value even further. For example, if 5 countries are steering trade, which gives a maximum benefit and doesn't scale further, the value will increase by 11.3% from base merchants alone, so not taking into account any bonuses from the actual trade steering modifier. You can see how powerful it is now, right? If you have many countries steering the trade towards one place throughout the entire chain, then it can create an enormous amount of value. And the best example for me personally is Levik's 1 million ducats campaign, where at the end of the game he releases miners to boost his trade steering through the trade leak modifiers. I'm not sure if he planned for that or not, but those small guys that he just released not only directly increased his trade steering through the trade leak bonuses, but also added their own merchants and further boosted the value themselves through their own trade steering. So it's a pretty cool trick. It was an amazing series for me, so go check it out if you haven't already. So now, going back to trade, your ultimate goal, especially if you're a massive empire, is to create a trade route that moves value smoothly from as far away as possible and all the way to your capital. And when I say as far away as possible, I mean not geographically, but in terms of the nodes. So, for example, if I'm the Netherlands, then even though Ivory Coast is pretty far, geographically speaking, in terms of node length, it's only one node away, so it doesn't count. If we steer the trade from China, Japan, the Malaccas, all the way to the Cape of Good Hope, then to Ivory Coast, and then to the English Channel, that would be an amazing chain and will increase our trade quite a lot. Each merchant along the way increases the value of the trade as it moves closer to your node. This compounding effect, just like investing IRL, like I said earlier, can take a trade that started at 100 value or so, let's say, and turn into 150 or even more by the time it reaches your home node, which will be further increased by your trade efficiency modifier. So in this case, in Constantinople, I'm collecting 205 ducats out of 110 of actual trade value. So you can see how all these modifiers add up to create the Giga Netherlands that I have right here. Well, I mean, not really, but you get the point. If you don't have much trade power in a node, so like here in Persia I only have about 6%, so like here I have about 9 ducats leaving to Astrakhan, which doesn't connect with me in any way, but even though I only have 6% here, and if I actually start transferring trade from Persia, I'll gain a decent amount of ducats, about 6%, partially because this is an inland node, so I'm getting a pretty hefty caravan bonus, as you can see here, but also because of the trade steering, as my 6.6 ducats is actually only 6.2, which has been multiplied by trade steering, and again, when it arrives in Aleppo, it will get further multiplied through these 3 merchants and then further get multiplied at Constantinople through my trade efficiency. A common mistake new players make is randomly placing your merchants wherever they see a lot of money. So like here I have Genoa, which is the second richest node in the world, and I could technically collect trade here, but as I don't have a single province or anything that could get me the value there, it would be a big mistake. So instead, think of your trade network like a chain, and each link, so in this case a merchant and a node, should pull trade closer to your capital. Ideally, that is. In my case, I have my main source of trade income is in Constantinople, so I'm pushing the trade both towards Constantinople and the English Channel, but ideally you want to focus on creating a clear and hopefully efficient way that maximizes the amount of trade that reaches your main node. So in my case, ideally I should conquer the majority of Germany to push the trade forward to Ragusa, Pest, Vienna, then along the German node, so maybe towards Saxony and Lübeck, and then towards the English Channel. And if I actually do that, 110 value or so that I have in Constantinople will multiply so much that by the time it gets to the English Channel, it could be well over 200 ducats. Alright, let me actually talk about how trade value is created in a node. This part is actually pretty straightforward. So the local value of a trade node is essentially the sum of all the trade value produced by each province in that node. So if we take Constantinople, for example, and take any province in that node, let's just take the Constantinople itself, we can see that it produces just under 7 of goods, and it produces glass that is valued at 6.5 ducats. So if you multiply these two numbers, what you will get is your trade value yearly. So if you want to figure out the monthly value, you just divide it by 12. As you can see here, in my case it's 48, partially thanks to an investment, a trade company investment that I have here, but I'll talk about that a bit later. The monthly value is just your base production value, which in my case is 4 ducats, as you can see at the top, which gets further multiplied by production efficiency modifiers and blah blah blah, but for our purposes the trade value is 4, meaning that this province produces about 4 ducats of local monthly value, which you can see right here. Constantinople, 4 ducats. So pretty simple, right? There are two main ways to boost how much a province produces. So there are flat rate increases and percentage modifiers. And let me talk about flat rate increases first, because they're pretty straightforward. So they can come from either one of two things. It can come from your base development. So in the case of Constantinople, again, I have about 17 production development, so diplodev, and it gives 0.2 goods produced per each development. So in that case, it will be 3.4 ducats from base production, as you can see right here. Then besides the development itself, we can build buildings and trade company investments to further increase that number. Obviously, the manufacturing gives +1 flat goods produced to any province that you build it in, and it's pretty good. It doesn't increase just your trade income, it also increases your production value, which will also multiply with trade efficiency. So it's a very powerful building. Don't just look at the number right here, it's usually more than that, and it could be way more than that depending on your trade setup and everything. What else you can do is build a trade company investment. For that it has to be a trade company, so obviously, and it's this building right here, so the brokers exchange, and it gives 0.3 goods produced flat as well, flat modifier. Alright, once you've built up the buildings and stuff, you want to look at percentage modifiers to really boost your production. This is where you can see some serious gains, because they usually apply nationwide. So the main way to get the goods produced modifiers throughout most of the game is from prosperity. So if you go back to our homeland, which is actually stated land, you can see that my prosperity is still ticking, and it's now at 21%, but when it actually reaches 100%, that's when I'll get local dev cost, monthly autonomy change, and most importantly, 25% local goods produced. This is one of the big reasons why you should always have a positive stability, because it helps you get to this point with prosperity, and that's an amazing boost to your economy out of thin air essentially. The other main things is policies, ideas, government reforms, hegemons, the economic hegemon, and modifiers of this sort. For example, if you have the economic hegemon, you can get an additional 25% goods produced. You can get a lot of goods produced policies from trade ideas. So for example, if you have trade alongside, let me take a look. If you have trade alongside infrastructure, you can get 10%. If you have trade alongside quantity, you can get 15%. And a lot of countries have trade, a lot of countries have goods produced in the national ideas. So like, for example, Germany right here, I believe they have around 20% goods produced. Yeah, Eisen and I assume that's iron and coal, 20% goods produced modifier. So that's amazing modifier. It's pretty much the best economic modifier in my opinion, because it increases your base goods, which will also increase your production and will also increase your trade value and stuff like that. It's a very strong modifier, and that's exactly why furnaces are such important buildings. They give 5% goods produced modifier globally as well, and you can only build them in the provinces with coal. Like I have coal right here in Kosovo. I needed to get to 20 dev to actually unlock the coal itself, but once I do so, and once I build the coal, and once I build the furnace, I'll get 5% goods produced globally, so not just in this province, but in my entire country. And that's quite amazing, because you can get quite a few gold provinces, especially if you are in Europe. There's a whole bunch right here. There's quite a lot spread throughout the whole world, and they all add up. So if you have 10 of them, you'll get 50% goods produced globally. And on top of that, there's this thing called strategic goods. So if you just go to your ledger and trade for strategic goods, if you have the most market share of any good in the world, then you will gain the strategic effect of the said good. And in the case of coal, it's really amazing. It gives additional 10% goods produced modifier. So you can see that how all of these furnaces add up, and you can become such a massive economic hegemon if you collect and control all of the coal mines with furnaces in the world. And that's also one of the big reasons why your economy spikes a lot during the endgame, because these are such powerful buildings, and not only that, worth quite a while by themselves. So I think this is a good point to talk about the trade goods themselves. So unfortunately, not all goods are created equal. Some goods are consistently valuable and can really boost the trade value in your node. So for example, luxury goods like silk, spices, gems, dyes, paper as well, all amazing goods, really high value and are consistently high throughout the game. Then there are metals like iron and copper, they're quite good as well. And then there's coal, which is the ultimate good because it's worth 10 ducats. It will decrease just slightly to 8 ducats with some events pretty soon, but still it's one of the best trade goods in the game. On the other hand, we have some terrible cheap goods like fish, like wool, like livestock usually. So for example, fish right here is worth 2 ducats. Then there's provinces with wool that is worth 2.5, and then naval supplies somewhere around here that is worth 3 ducats. In my opinion, naval supplies and wool are the worst trade goods in the game, because at least other food type goods, so like wine and grain and all of these things, they get additional bonus from the soldier's household, so you gain a lot of manpower from them, as you can see right here. So they're pretty good, at least because of that. But wool, at least, and naval supplies, they don't have anything like that. They don't have any redeeming feature like that. They're just plain bad. And that's also why one of the reasons why some nodes are extremely rich and wealthy and others are dirt poor. So for example, Eastern European nodes, so like Kiev and Novgorod and Crimea as well, they don't have any particularly expensive goods. Like most of Kiev is just grain and livestock and wool and I mean some iron, but that's pretty much it. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do about your goods themselves, so the next best thing is to expand elsewhere and bring the value from somewhere else. So like for example, India has an amazing goods. They have a lot of silk, they have a lot of iron, they have a lot of spices, they have a lot of gems. Where is it? They have a lot of gems, they have a lot of cotton, which are pretty high value goods. And now, one of the things that some people not realize is that goods themselves, on top of giving the strategic goods modifier, they have their own local modifiers. So one of the most famous one, for example, would be the cloth and cotton modifier that gives 10% local dev cost in that province. And that's quite nice, that's one of the nicer ones. The other, not too well known ones could be the salt provinces that give additional 15% local defensiveness, so that could be a good province to build your fort in. The other ones could be the provinces with gems that have an additional tax modifier, so it's really nice to have gems in Constantinople, for example, through the event, because you have very high base tax and it all adds up with the tax efficiency from the gems. Then there are goods like glass, which is also quite nice, it gives local production efficiency. But one of the secretly powerful ones are actually grain and naval supplies out of all things. So naval supplies give 0.5% force limit. So even if this province is a tree development wasteland, as long as it has naval supply building in it, it will give a decent amount of naval force limit. So for example, this one province gives 1.2, and a good portion of that comes from the naval supply itself. And same thing applies to grain, just they give 0.5%, 0.5 of land force limit. So if you ever thought why does Russia and Lithuania and all these countries have such a high force limit, even when they're dirt poor and they don't have anything else going for them, it's because of grain. And similarly, in the strategic goods, grain also gives 20% national land force limit, and the naval supplies give 20% naval force limit. So that's something that you might not always remember, but it's actually quite powerful. So for example, cloths, they give 5% trade efficiency, quite nice. Fur gives yearly prestige, quite nice. Chinaware, yearly Republican tradition, amazing if you're playing as a Republic. Wine, national honors, quite nice. Again, coal, 10% goods produced, really nice. Cotton, 20% global settler increase, also quite nice for colonial game. Ivory, 2 Diplo rep, which could be a game changer for your Diplo gameplay or HRE gameplay, for example, in the late game. Then there's tropical wood, 5% global dev cost modifier, very nice. So that's something that just have at the back of your head. It's not necessary to always think about that. And also there's another category which is called the production leader. It doesn't give you the same modifier like being a leader in the market share gives you, but it does give you 10% goods produced in that specific good provinces. So for example, I'm a global leader of cloth, and that's why I get an additional 10% from being the production leader, as you can see right here. So if you expand a lot and you control a lot of trade, not only gain the money directly from the trade, but you can also get a lot of the modifiers like these, and that's one of the big reasons why trade is so powerful. Alright, now let's talk about trade companies. First of all, I think it's crucial to understand that companies offer a massive boost, apparently up to 200% goods produced, but more than that in a second, in provinces that are not part of a trade company, and I repeat, not part of the company. This is a key detail that you can't afford to overlook. There's a button, for example, if I click Constantinople right here, I have assigned provinces to trade company, and you should never ever click it. You'll lose a lot of money doing so, and it's not just the money. Trade companies also eat up more governing capacities and regular territories, so you'll lose both. So please don't use it. Assigning a province to a trade company gives quite a lot of modifiers, but most importantly is the 100% local trade power and also the province governing cost. So that's pretty much the two key things. There's also the fact that you cannot convert the province once you add it to a trade company. It will not affect your religious unity, for example, but it's still something that you should know. Because, for example, if I had not Sunni here, but my main religion, which is Reformed, then I would have quite a bit higher unrest reduction from my tolerance of the true faith. So there's still technically some bonus to converting your provinces before adding them to a trade company, but it's not necessary. The religion doesn't give any penalties to the goods produced that a normal province might have from the religion. So if I go right here, for example, I can get a minus 30% from intolerance, but if I add it to a trade company, that effect doesn't apply anymore. Now, going back to the goods produced modifier, which you can see in this screen right here, provincial trade power, that is in your trade company and divided by the total provincial power of the entire node, and it multiplies that number by the institution. So for example, I have the latest institution there is, industrialization, so I have the max possible bonus. So in my case, it multiplies 75%. If I go to the subjects and to the trade company interactions, I can see that my Dutch Anatolia company controls 74.9% of the trade node, and that's exactly what's happening right here. I'm getting 74.9 multiplied by the 200% from the industrialization institution. You heard that right. The higher the embrace institution level, the more goods produced you get, and up to 200% during the age of industrialization. If you had no idea about this before, don't worry, as I also had absolutely no clue about this until like 5 minutes ago when I was researching and wrote the script for the video. Told you, now you can proudly say that you have masters in EU4 trade. And actually, now taking this info into account, the difference in production output with and without trade companies is absolutely massive. So if I just take a look at any province that I did not add to a trade company, take Ankara right here, it's not part of a trade company, so it's getting the absolutely insane 150% goods produced from the trade company. And being just a 10 development province, it's generating an enormous amount of trade value for me, despite being the wrong religion and everything. And for example, in comparison, if I go back to my homeland and I take a more developed province, like Amsterdam for example, that has a lot more development, it's still not giving me as much goods, simply because the goods produced efficiency in my capital is a measly 35% and cannot really compare to what I can get from a trade company. And for example, if I have another province like this one, which is in a trade company, you can see that I'm not getting any of the mentioned 150 goods produced, because again, only in the provinces that are not part of a trade company in that node. The best way to maximize your trade income and trade companies is to add only the trade centers, so for example these provinces right here, and increase them as high as you can and build a bunch of trade buildings there. That way, these provinces will control quite a lot of the trade power in this node. So in my case right now it's about 75%, as you can see it in the subjects interaction menu, about 75%. But if I increase this Constantinople trade node to level 2 or maybe even level 3, build a trade building right here, build some other investments right here in other provinces, I could probably realistically get it to maybe 90% or 95%, and that will give me not 150% goods produced, but around 180 to 190, and that's really insane. And same thing applies to literally every single node, right? So same in Aleppo, I just have the trade company, I just added the trade centers to the company, and I'm getting the insane goods produced amount. So basically, now that you know this, please don't add every single province to your trade company. Just add the trade centers. If you cannot get to 50% to get a merchant, maybe you can add some extra provinces just to get to that 50%, but you should never ever add the entire node to a trade company. It's a really bad decision. So basically, if you have a lot of trade companies, like in my case I'm playing against the Netherlands, if I have a lot of trade companies in Asia, in like Japan, China region, and I add only the key provinces, then I can get an insane amount of value. Let's take a look at here. It produced around 14. If I controlled it and I had trade centers in the company, then I could probably get it to around 25, 30 local value, and just like investing, it will multiply to around 5 to 10%, right, around 10%. I'll get it to 33 right here, just the value from the Hangzhou trade node, to 33 right here, then around 36, then around 40 ducats, then around 45, and by the time it reaches to the English channel, the original 30 is now 50. Alright, now that we've got the basics covered, let's talk a bit more about trade company investments, how they work, what they do, and which ones you should build. So I'll just say it straight away, there are basically 4 trade company buildings that you should use in your single player games, And there are some other ones that are a bit more specific. So let's just start with the basic ones that you need in every single game, and that's harbor and local venture buildings. So harbor building is a local trade power and local production efficiency modifier. And the key thing here is the trade power, because that's the more trade power you have in a node, provincial trade power you have in your trade companies, the more goods produced you'll get, but you can also use it to actually get to the 51% that you need to get a merchant from a node. So, for example, in my case, I built it in pretty much every single province. As you can see, I cannot build any new ones. I have it in every single province to get more goods, get more trade power, and to actually control the nodes better. The next thing you should be using is local venture buildings. That's giving another production efficiency modifier, but it's also giving local goods produced. And one of the surprising things is that unlike the trade power building, for example, I have the goods produced building in Constantinople right here, and you can see that it's giving me 0.3 from the broker's exchange investment in the base goods produced tab at the top. But for example, the other provinces in this state that are not part of the trade company, right? So I only have the Constantinople in the node itself. So if I go to Edirne, for example, it's also getting the 0.3% goods from the broker's exchange investment, even though it's not part of a trade company. And that's really interesting to me, because that works for the goods produced investment, but it doesn't work for the trade power investment. So if you go back to Edirne, it's not getting any flat for trade power from the investment. And that actually works quite a lot in our favor, because we want as much goods produced as possible. We want as much goods produced as possible, right? We want a lot of value to be filthy rich. But then we also don't want a lot of trade power outside of our trade company. So like I wouldn't want this to be a 2000 dev 1 million trade power province, because then I would have to add it to a trade company as well, and I don't really want to do that. But because I'm only getting the trade power in Constantinople, so as you can see, company depot investment +4, I'm not getting that in Edirne, so that's really nice. I don't know if it's a bug, maybe it's not supposed to work like that, but it does, and you should take advantage of that for sure. The other buildings are company garrison, which gives local defensiveness and supply limit modifier. I pretty much never ever build these things. I don't know anyone that does. Then there's foreign influence, which gives tax modifier and dev cost. It could be useful if you're, for example, trying to get your province to a bit more dev. Maybe you want to increase it to level 2 or level 3, the trade center I mean, and you need some extra dev to actually upgrade that. It could be nice for that, and it also works provinces in the same states that are not part of the company. So just like goods produced, you can also get the dev cost in Edirne right here, for example. And that's exactly what I was talking about. I don't understand how it works 100%, because I'm not getting the tax modifier from that investment, but I'm getting the dev cost modifier, and that's basically how it works for others. If I do it with the manpower investment, for example, I'm obviously getting the manpower in Constantinople itself because it's part of the trade company, but I'm not getting the manpower in Edirne. So I don't understand why I'm getting the dev cost and the goods produced necessarily, but that's just how it works. We don't question it, we just take advantage of that, alright? Don't tell that to Paradox. Right, that now that I'm actually out of the war, I can use it to upgrade my trade centers to higher level. And let's take a look at what impact that will actually do if I just upgrade some of these provinces and upgrade the trade centers. And as you can see, my goods produced went from 150 to 165%. So even if you already have the merchant, there's still point to further invest into the company, to increase the trade centers, to build more trade power buildings in them. Now let's talk about the more expensive 1000 ducat worth company investments. So there are the company garrison for land force limit, local venture for 50% trade steering, and I already showed you how it works in the case of Aleppo, for example. Then there's a governance building, which gives some sailors and manpower and the autonomy reduction. Then there's a harbor one for naval force limit, and then there's a foreign influence for yearly army tradition and, more importantly, trade value modifier. Now let me immediately tell you that company garrison, the harbor one and governance one, you should pretty much never ever use. The trade steering and the trade value modifiers are way better, and you should be building them instead of the other ones, because that's the entire purpose of the trade company. They are a bit more situational, but I pretty much never use them, except for multiplayer, which I'll talk about in just a second. Alright, so you already saw how trade steering works. In the case of Aleppo, trade steering gives me an additional 50% trade steering in this particular node. So you can think about it as essentially increasing the outgoing value in the node by 2.5%, right? Because the base value from a merchant is 5 and we're getting 50% from the investment. So we're essentially getting extra 2.5% value out of the trade node. So you can see that I'm increasing the value by 9.2. So 2.5% of that comes from the investment essentially. And that's pretty powerful. And you should be building that in majority of your nodes upstream. So for example, if I'm the Netherlands, I should 100% build the trade steering building in Ivory Coast and Cape of Good Hope, perhaps in Zanzibar, in Malacca. So basically the trade steering one is really powerful. The other good one is the 10% trade value modifier. The way it works is that I have it, for example, in Constantinople node, and the way it works is essentially, if we just dumb it down a bit, it essentially increases the price of all trade goods in that node by 10%. So you can see that here my trade value is 15.3 or 15.9 without the investment, and it's around 17.5 with the investment. Because it affects the trade value itself, it also affects my production income thanks to that. So essentially, the way I think about it, it just makes my naval supplies worth 3.3, my glass worth about just over 7, my cloth worth about 4.62, and just 10% increase in price. The way I think it's that if you have a rich node very far away from your home node, so for example, if it's the first node in your chain, let's say that I control nodes, every single node all the way from Nippon and all the way to the English Channel, I would build the trade value investment right here, because I'll get 10% more trade value out of it, right? That's quite a bit more than 2.5% we get from the trade steering. And because it's the first node, I'm not really steering a lot of trade from before, right? I'm not pushing a lot of trade from, what is this called, from Polynesia to Nippon, right? I just have the Nippon itself. So I'll be building a trade value investment here. But then further down the line, when I push Nippon into Hangzhou, I still might build the trade value modifier here, because it's still just a second node. But let's say I'm now pushing both the value of Nippon and Hangzhou and all the way to Malacca. Now right here, even though it's a really valuable node, I might think about building a trade steering building, because I'll increase not only the Malacca trade, but also the value that I got from Nippon and Hangzhou by 2.5%. And that could be quite a lot of money. And obviously in the Cape of Good Hope, I'll definitely build a trade steering building, because this is a pretty poor node. There's not a lot of value coming from this node itself. So there's not really a point in building the trade value investment right here. But on the other hand, we're pushing a lot of Asian value to the Cape of Good Hope, so we should definitely build the trade steering building here. And the same thing for our Ivory Coast trade node, for example. We are building trade steering building right here, because we are pushing a lot of value already, and there's not much value in our home node. And vice versa, in the case of Constantinople, for example. I'm not really pushing the value anywhere else, I'm just collecting there. In that case, I build a trade value building, and you should be doing the same. I'm talking about a very perfect scenario where you have quite a lot of money to spare and you're just trying to efficiently use your earnings. Before you actually start pouring the money into these investments, I just want you to make sure that you've got a solid trade route in place to actually funnel all that trade value into your home node, control all your key trade centers, all your key nodes, because otherwise you'll be waiting a long time for any meaningful return from your investment, right? We take it very seriously here. So probably if you're just in your early stage of the game, actually control the valuable trade nodes and trade centers and only then start to work on your trade company investments. But if you have a comfortable income and you have a lot of cash reserves, then obviously you should go for trade company investments. Alright, so now that I mentioned the key things that you should be building in all the games, so the trade value and the trade steering ones, let me talk about one quite rare use case for the naval and land force limit buildings. So let's imagine for a second that we are playing in multiplayer and we are France.
France was France.
If you can somehow persuade or just threaten, like for example, a Tunis guy right here, if you can just ask for any province, so let's take this tree development Tatawin province in the Tunisian desert. You can use this terrible tree development province, add it to a trade company and just build the force limit building. So you'll essentially get 5 flat force limit from this one province that is only tree development, and that's a pretty efficient way to scale your country further without too many territorial gains. And another thing that you could do, if you're colonial power for example, one of the most powerful ways to increase your economy is actually to move your capital to another node, to another subcontinent, because that way you can add your home provinces to a trade company. So for example, if you're playing as Ottomans, you are in a very sweet spot because your capital, so Constantinople, is in Eastern Europe, so you can add all the Levant provinces and Persian provinces and everything eastwards to a trade company. And Constantinople itself is actually a node that is in 2 continents, so you can straight off the bat add, for example, these Greek islands to a trade company and build, for example, the trade value investment right there, because it will increase your economy in the entire node, right? And for example, if you're playing as a colonial power, let's say if we're playing as England, let me just use tags, don't mind me. Alright, let's say I'm England for example, and I have quite a bunch of admin power saved up. What you can do is move your capital to the new world, because that's the best place to have your capital. You cannot add any companies in the trade node anyways, because they're your colonies, but it allows you to add essentially the rest of the world. So the entirety of Europe, Asia and African territories and everything else to a trade company. If you ever played this colonial power, you might know that you cannot move your capital just directly to the new world. So let's say I have this Canadian province right here in Buffalo, or I guess American province. We cannot move our capital to a colonial region. So the way to bypass this restriction is to move your capital first to, let's say, Africa. I can move it to St. Helena right here, and boom, it's already in Africa. I can actually go to Bermuda, which I think is the best province to have your capital in. So now we are not in a colonial region, so to say, because this doesn't belong to any colonial region, but now we are actually in, what is this province? We are now in Central American region, subcontinent technically. So now, with just this simple trick, I can still add my East African provinces to a trade company, so I can add these 2 trade nodes to a Zanzibar trade company and get a lot of value out of here. But most importantly, I can now like destate some of these lands right here. For example, if I destate Scottish provinces, I can add these 2 to a trade company. I can also destate what is a powerful state? I can also destate London, for example, and get a merchant out of here first of all, but also get quite a lot of goods produced in this node, because that's exactly how it works. I'm getting 60% goods produced in every single province in the English Channel. And it's not just me, by the way, every other country is getting the same modifier as well. So if you go to Amsterdam right here, it's also getting 60% from a trade company. So sometimes with trade companies, you can actually partner up with countries, so to say, especially in multiplayer games, and you can divide your trade evenly, or you can even let someone else control some trade centers in your node. So for example, if I am England and I can add this to a trade company, so now Bengal is getting 20% goods produced nationwide. Not too great of a deal, but you know, there are a lot of possibilities in this game. In my opinion, if you want to be really efficient with your economy, moving your capital to a different subcontinent is always the way to go. These provinces, so like Bermuda and Galapagos Islands, are the best provinces to do that, but it doesn't have to be New World either. If you're playing as Russia, for example, I like to conquer Finland because it's Western Europe, and you can move my capital to Helsinki, for example, and add a lot of the Russian lands into a trade company. Right, now let me go through some trivia modifiers, so some random modifiers and other modifiers that affect the set random modifiers. So for example, stability, it affects your caravan power if you are at negative stability. So for example, I have a merchant in the Champagne node and I'm getting 62.5% from caravan power because I have the trade ideas that gives the additional 25% caravan power. But if, for example, I had negative stability, it affects my caravan power, so minus 5%, and it scales up to minus 15%. The other thing that's a bit more obvious is prestige and power projection, because both of them actually give global trade power, and they actually give 15% global trade power both for power projection and prestige. So it's really good to try to maintain your prestige at a very high level, because that way you'll get a lot more value. And another thing that you should know about is that colonies, so in my case Newfoundland for example, so colonies with over 10 development as well, with over 10 provinces, they give a merchant right, but they also give a global trade power modifier. So in this case, it's giving me 5%. I mean, it's a flat modifier, and if you have quite a lot of colonies, so if you have like 5 colonies in the New World, perhaps 1 in Australia, then you can get quite a lot of trade power just from your colonies alone. And your colonies also transfer 50% of their own trade power to you, the overlord. 144 trade power from Newfoundland, and that's why colonial powers are filthy rich. They not only get to steal all the trade value from the colonies, but they also get a lot of additional trade power that they can use to steal your trade. So it's a win-win for them, lose-lose for you. Now, just to finish the video off, I want to talk briefly about privateering. It's one of the most underrated yet occasionally useful tool in the game. One of the best ways to actually use privateers is to send them to trade nodes of massive colonial empires. So let's say I am Great Britain and I can send privateers down to Sevilla, so the nodes that Spain and Portugal control. So not only will I steal a bit of their trade, there's already Denmark here by the way, not only am I stealing a bit of their trade, and I'm getting it in the form of spoils of war, because I'm getting 6 ducats a month from stealing trade from Sevilla essentially, but also portion of the treasure chests that the colonies sent. So for example, Spanish Peru and Portuguese Brazil, they have quite a lot of gold, alongside New Spain obviously. They have quite a lot of gold, and they send that gold to the colonial overlords through treasure chests, right? So for example, if we go to Spain, you can see that Peru, for example, will send treasure fleet worth 240 ducats in half a year. And if there's still British privateers in the Sevilla trade node, they'll also get a portion of that treasure fleet. Other than that, it's a pretty gimmicky mechanic. It doesn't work very well. There's a lot of penalties if you actually decide to privateer, because every couple of there's quite a lot of negative events with that. You can get a trade efficiency penalty event, which is really bad, and It might actually cost you money to privateer in that case. So it's not always the best. You can still use it again to steal treasure chests or to gain power projection. So I'm getting 10% power projection from sending privateers against Spain, which is quite nice and could help you get, over 50 if you are in a tight spot. It's fun to play around with your friends or in multiplayer, when you have a massive colonial empire and you can just casually send 100 light ships to Coromandel to, troll the person and kill all the trade. But usually you're much better off actually protecting trade instead of doing that, so just keep that in mind. And remember guys, the best way to steal someone's trade is to turn up on their shores with a bunch of heavies and troops and open up the country.
Open the country. Stop having it be closed, said the United States.